She walked into her own wedding and walked out with nothing. No ring, no name, no future. Just 500 people watching her burn. If you've ever been destroyed by someone you trusted completely, stay with me. Because this story is about what happens when a woman with nothing left to lose finds the one man powerful enough to rewrite the rules. Watch until the end. Hit like if this hits different. And drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The wedding was supposed to begin at 4 o'clock. By 3:52, Avery Sinclair already knew something was wrong. She stood in the bridal suite on the 14th floor of the Caldwell Grand, a venue she had personally designed 2 years earlier. The same vaulted ceilings she'd specified, the same Italian marble floors she'd sourced herself, the same cluster lighting suspended like frozen stars above the ballroom below. She knew every inch of this building the way a surgeon knows the inside of a chest cavity. She had stood in that ballroom 100 times with blueprints rolled under her arm and a coffee going cold in her hand, arguing about sconce placement and drapery weight with contractors who thought she was too young to know what she was doing. She had always proved them wrong. Today she stood at the window in $3,200 worth of ivory silk and watched the valet line below with a feeling she couldn't name. Not nerves. She'd been nervous before client presentations, before bidding wars, before the Whitmore Commission that put her name on the map at 26. This was different. This was the feeling of a room whose temperature has dropped without any window opening. Her maid of honor, Cassie, was fussing with the bustle behind her. "You look unreal," Cassie said. "Seriously, Grant's going to lose his mind." Avery said nothing. She was watching a man in a gray suit near the service entrance. He was talking into a phone and looking up at the building, not like a guest checking the address, like a man confirming a position. "Avery?" Cassie touched her shoulder. "Hey, you okay?" "Who cleared the AV setup?" Cassie blinked. "What?" "The screens, the projection screens in the ballroom." Avery had specified those screens for slideshows during the reception, a curated gallery of photos she and Grant had selected together, their life assembled into 5 minutes of images set to music she'd chosen herself. She had personally handed the USB drive to the venue coordinator 3 days ago. "Who cleared the final setup? Did you check?" "That's not—" "Avery, we have 12 minutes. "Who checked it, Cassie?" A pause. "I assumed the coordinator." Avery was already moving toward the door. She made it to the top of the grand staircase before her future mother-in-law materialized at the bottom, like something conjured from expensive perfume and practiced grace. Lenora Holloway was 61 years old and had never once in Avery's presence looked anything less than perfectly arranged. Cashmere in winter, linen in summer, a smile that lived entirely above the teeth. "Avery," the smile appeared, "you look beautiful. Grant is going to be so proud." There was something in the word proud that sat wrong. Not happy, not overwhelmed, proud, like a man admiring property he'd acquired. "I need to check the AV setup," Avery said. "Darling, the staff has everything handled. Come down and I'll be 2 minutes." She moved past Lenora before the woman could redirect her again, cutting through the service corridor that ran behind the ballroom's north wall. A passage she knew because she had argued for its width during the renovation phase, insisted it be wide enough for equipment movement. She knew where the AV booth was. She had approved its location herself. The booth was a small elevated room behind the ballroom's rear wall, accessible through a door marked "Technical Personnel Only." The door was unlocked. Inside, a young technician in a black polo was bent over a laptop, headphones around his neck, and he startled badly when Avery pushed through the door in her wedding gown. "Ma'am, this area is restricted. I'm the bride." She looked past him at the screen. "What's loaded in the queue?" The queue was updated about an hour ago. Mr. Holloway's assistant sent new files." Avery went very still. "Grant's assistant?" "Yes, ma'am. Said there was a last-minute change to the slideshow. Mr. Holloway approved it personally." She looked at the file names on the screen. They meant nothing, generic strings of numbers. But there were 2 files in the queue. She had submitted one. "Play it," she said. The technician hesitated. "Ma'am, the ceremony's about to—" "Play the first file." He played it. 40 seconds. That was all it took to understand that her life as she knew it was over. The footage was time-stamped, edited with a professionalism that made her stomach drop. Not amateur, not shaky or accidental, but deliberate, structured like a case being made. Avery and a man she barely recognized, a client she'd met twice for a commercial redesign in Henderson, caught in what appeared to be an intimate moment in a hotel corridor. The angle was perfect. The lighting was clear. Any reasonable person watching it would draw exactly one conclusion. The footage was fabricated. She knew it the way she knew the feel of her own hands. The client's name was Marcus Webb, and the meeting in that corridor had lasted 4 minutes because she'd been walking him to the elevator after a site walkthrough. But the edit removed everything before and after. It kept only the moment they'd been standing close, reviewing photos on her phone, his head bent near hers because the screen was small and the corridor was bright. 40 seconds. Her entire reputation compressed into 40 seconds of someone else's narrative. She looked at the technician. Her voice, when it came out, was steadier than she expected. "Don't play that file. Do you understand me? Do not play that file." Mr. Holloway's instructions were, "I am Avery Sinclair. My name is on this venue's renovation. I have the original contract in my office, with my signature at the bottom of 47 pages. You will not play that file, or I will have this building's ownership on the phone before the hour is out." The technician went pale. She turned and walked back out. The ballroom was filling. She could hear it through the walls. The low register of 500 people settling into seats. The murmur of programs being opened. The faint string quartet winding into position. She stood in the service corridor with her back against the wall and her hands pressed flat against the plaster, and she breathed. In, out, in. The silk of the gown felt suddenly wrong against her skin, too heavy, too much of someone else's idea of what this day should look like. She had 3 options. She could go back upstairs and not appear. The ceremony would dissolve into confusion, eventually into cancellation. She would be the woman who disappeared at the altar. The narrative would be written without her. She could confront Grant before the ceremony began. She had no evidence beyond what she knew in her body. He had an assistant, resources, the ability to say the footage had been sent without his knowledge. He could make her look unstable, paranoid, a woman breaking down on her wedding day. Or she could walk in. She walked in. The ballroom was everything she had designed it to be. The light falling exactly as the chandeliers had been angled, the floral arrangements filling the space the way she had sketched them on a napkin at 2 a.m. during the renovation pitch. She walked down the aisle and the quartet shifted into the processional and 500 people stood and turned to look at her, and she kept her eyes fixed on the man waiting at the altar. Grant Holloway was 34 years old and had the kind of face that read as trustworthy from a distance. Square jaw, clean shirt, the particular ease of a man who had never had to question whether rooms would open for him. He was smiling. The smile looked right. It looked genuine. She studied it the whole length of that aisle and she could not find the seam. The officiant began to speak. The standard words, the expected structure. Avery stood in front of the man she had agreed to marry, and she watched his face, and she waited. She didn't have to wait long. Grant raised one hand slightly, a small, rehearsed gesture aimed at someone in the back of the room, and then the screens lit up. The footage ran on 4 simultaneous screens. The ballroom saw it in high definition. 40 seconds of a story that wasn't true, displayed in front of everyone who mattered in her professional and personal life. There was a moment of total silence, the kind that happens when a room full of people processes something simultaneously. And then the sound came back like a wave cresting, whispers multiplying into a low roar. Avery did not move. She watched Grant's face. The smile was still there, but it had changed into something else. Something with a harder architecture beneath it. Something she should have been able to see before today and hadn't. And the failure of that observation felt like a physical thing in her chest. "I think," Grant said, and his voice was carrying now, using the room's acoustics with the comfort of a man who had rehearsed this, "that you owe these people an explanation." There was a sound from the left side of the front row. Lenora Holloway pressed a handkerchief to her face. The handkerchief was dry. Avery could have said many things. She had words available, the truth, the counterargument, the names of the dates and times that contradicted every frame of that footage. She could have called the technician into the room. She could have stood there and fought it out in front of 500 witnesses. She looked at Grant. She looked at Lenora. She looked at the dry handkerchief and the rehearsed smile and the footage still cycling on the screens because no one had thought to cut the feed. She turned around and walked out the same way she came in. She heard Lenora's voice behind her carrying perfectly. I tried to warn him. She did not stop walking. The cab driver didn't ask why a woman in a wedding gown was hailing him on the Caldwell Grand's front steps at 4:17 in the afternoon. Las Vegas cab drivers had a gift for incuriosity. He took her where she said, a bar on Fremont Street she named at random, something she'd passed in a cab 2 years ago, and filed away for reasons she couldn't explain. And she gave him 3 times the fare and didn't wait for change. The bar was called The Meridian. Dark wood, low lighting, a long counter that ran the length of the room. Not a tourist place. The kind of bar that existed in the gaps between the casinos, where people drank because they meant to, rather than because they'd stumbled in looking for somewhere to sit down. She took a stool at the far end of the counter, set her phone face down on the bar, and told the bartender to bring her whatever was most likely to result in not remembering this evening. The bartender, a broad-shouldered man with a scar through his left eyebrow and the manner of someone who had heard everything, looked at her once, looked at the dress, and poured 2 fingers of bullet without being asked. She drank it. He poured another without comment. Her phone was vibrating through the bar top. She could feel it without looking. Cassie, her assistant, her mother, who was going to have strong feelings about this. The photographers, maybe. The venue coordinator. Everyone who had witnessed 500 people watch her professional and personal life get demolished in 40 seconds of edited footage. She turned the phone over and looked at it. 15 missed calls in 20 minutes. She turned it back over. The third drink was halfway gone when she became aware of someone sitting down 2 stools to her left, not beside her, 1 space removed, which was the precise distance that communicated awareness without intrusion. She didn't look up. They're going to keep calling, the voice said. She looked up. The man was somewhere in his late 30s, dark hair, dark suit, the kind of suit that cost more than most people's monthly rent without advertising the fact. He was watching the bottles behind the bar rather than looking at her directly, which was either good manners or a studied affect she hadn't determined yet. His hands on the counter were still. No drink in front of him. "Excuse me?" she said. "Your phone." He nodded at the device. "Whoever it is, they'll keep calling until you answer or until they figure out you've made a decision." He paused. "Have you?" "I don't know you." "No," he agreed. "Then why are you talking to me?" He was quiet for a moment. Not the silence of someone searching for an answer. The silence of someone who already has one and is deciding whether the timing is right to give it. "Because I've been in this bar for 40 minutes, he said finally. "And you're the first person who came through that door looking like they'd just survived something." She studied him. He was still looking at the bottles. The stillness about him was unusual, not the stillness of someone trying to appear calm, but of someone for whom stillness was simply the default state, as if the world moved around him rather than with him. "I didn't survive anything," she said. "I walked out." "That's the same thing." She finished the third drink, set the glass down with more control than she felt. "You want to tell me what you think you know about my evening?" He looked at her for the first time. His eyes were a dark brown that registered as black in the bar's low light. They were the eyes of someone who had learned to see things in their entirety rather than in pieces, assessing, not predatory. There was a difference, and she was in the business of spaces and how they made people feel, and she recognized the difference. "I know you walked into that bar wearing a wedding gown," he said, "and you're drinking alone, and your phone hasn't stopped since you sat down, and you haven't cried once. That last part is the one that matters." She said nothing. "People who cry are still hoping someone will come and fix it," he said. "You're not hoping for that. You're already past the part where it can be fixed." The bartender appeared, refilled her glass without being asked, and disappeared again with the discretion of a man paid to have good instincts. She looked at the drink, and then at the man 2 stools over. "What's your name?" she said. "Damian Moretti." She waited for the name to mean something. It took 3 seconds. the lag between recognition and processing, the way a sound registers before you identify its source. Moretti. She had been in Las Vegas for 4 years. She had designed 3 properties in this city and toured a dozen more. She knew which names moved quietly through rooms and which ones opened doors without being spoken. Moretti was both. "You should probably go back to wherever you came from," she said. "Probably," he agreed. He didn't move. She drank. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, which was itself uncomfortable. She didn't know this man, and she had just had the worst hour of her adult life, and she should not be sitting in a bar feeling anything other than completely alone. "Why were you here for 40 minutes?" she said. "I come here sometimes when I need to think without being observed." "And no one observes you here." "The owner knows me. The staff knows what I need." He said it without arrogance. The simple statement of a man describing the geography of his own life. "It's one of the few places in this city where I don't have to perform being what I am." She looked around the bar. The bartender was occupied at the far end. The 2 other patrons were deep in their own conversations. Nobody was looking at the man to her left. But she had the distinct impression that this apparent privacy was a constructed thing, maintained by people whose job was to make it appear natural. She was a designer. She understood constructed environments. "What happened tonight?" she said. Not a question. "I don't know the specifics. But you know something." He was quiet for a moment. "I know the Holloway name," he said, "and I know what Lenora Holloway wants and how she tends to acquire it." He paused. "I know the footage they showed was edited, not because I know you, because Lenora Holloway doesn't do things cleanly unless they're constructed to look that way." Avery set down her drink. Her hands were steadier than they should have been. "You've been watching the Holloway family." "The Holloway family has been attempting to acquire 3 properties I own for the past 18 months. His voice was even. "I watch everyone who tries to take something from me." "And you just happened to be in this bar tonight." "I was here before you arrived." A pause. "I won't pretend that's entirely coincidence." She absorbed that. It should have alarmed her. A powerful stranger in a quiet bar, already aware of the broad strokes of her disaster. But the alarm didn't come. Instead, there was something colder and more functional. The same clarity she felt when a construction problem presented itself, and the solution was unconventional but sound. "What do you want?" she said. He turned toward her fully for the first time. In the low light, there was something almost architectural about him, by clean lines, nothing wasted, the impression of a structure built to bear significant load. "I want to make you a proposal," he said. She almost laughed. "You're joking." "I don't joke about business. This isn't business." "Everything is business," he said, which is not the same as saying nothing is personal. He looked at her steadily. "You have a reputation that's been deliberately destroyed. I have standing enemies who happen to overlap with the people who destroyed it. You have nothing left to lose. I have a particular problem that requires a solution your presence would provide." She stared at him. "What kind of solution?" "A wife," he said. "A legal marriage, on paper, and in the eyes of whatever legal institution needs to see it. In exchange, I will use every resource I have to find out who built that footage and why, restore your professional name, and remove from your life the people who took it from you." The bar was quiet around them. Outside, Las Vegas was doing what it always did, burning and spinning and performing its relentless theater of light and noise. In here, in the dark corner of a bar that smelled like old oak and good whiskey, a man she had known for 12 minutes was offering her a transaction that would have sounded insane at any other point in her life. She looked at him. He didn't look away. "If I say no," she said, "you walk out of here and continue drinking alone. And tomorrow you start over from nothing, and the people who did this to you face no consequence. And if I say yes, then you come with me," he said, "and we build something out of what they broke." Avery Sinclair looked down at her wedding gown. Ivory silk, $3,200, the physical evidence of a future that had lasted until 4:17 this afternoon. She looked at her phone, 18 missed calls. She looked at the man to her left, who was watching her with the patient attention of someone who had already run the odds and decided they were acceptable. She had designed spaces her entire career. She understood that the most important decisions about a room weren't made in the finished product. They were made in the empty space before anything was built, in the gap between what existed and what could. "Tell me one thing," she said. "Ask. Why does a man like you need a wife on paper?" Something shifted in his expression. Not a softening, but an adjustment, like a lens coming into precise focus. "Because there are rooms in this city," he said, "that I cannot walk into alone without confirming every assumption people have already made about me. And there are rooms I need to be in before the end of this month." She held his gaze for a long moment. "I want everything in writing," she said. "Terms, conditions, exit clauses." "Of course." "And I want the footage. Original files, chain of custody, everything your people find." "You'll have it." She picked up the drink, finished it, set the glass down with the sound of a decision being made. "Marry me instead," she repeated back at him, his words from earlier testing their weight. They held. The structure was sound. "Yes," Damien Moretti said. Avery Sinclair set down the glass and stood up from the bar stool 40 minutes into the worst night of her life and looked at the man who had just offered her a war in place of a wedding. "Then we have a lot to talk about," she said. Outside the window, the neon of Fremont Street threw red and gold across the pavement, and somewhere across the city, in a ballroom she had designed herself, Lenora Holloway was still performing her grief for an audience that didn't know they were watching a performance. Avery could feel it, the distance between here and there, the clean break of it, the way this moment sat at the hinge between before and after. She didn't know yet that the footage Damien's team would pull from a secured server inside the Holloway estate in 72 hours would contain not just the edited clip, but a second file. An unedited raw recording of Lenora Holloway on a phone call 16 days before the wedding, confirming the delivery of the fabricated evidence to a man whose name Avery had never heard, a man named Victor Sorrento. And she didn't know yet that when his investigators ran that name, Damien Moretti would go completely still in a way she had not seen before. The stillness, not of calm, but of a man who has just heard the opening note of a song he hoped he would never hear again. She didn't know any of that yet, but she picked up her coat from the stool beside her and she walked toward the door, and Damien Moretti followed her out into the Nevada night, and the door of the Meridian swung shut behind them both. The car was a black Escalade with tinted glass and no plates visible from the outside. Avery noticed the plates first, or rather, noticed their absence, and filed it without comment the way she filed everything she couldn't immediately act on. The driver didn't introduce himself. He opened the rear door and looked at a point approximately 6 inches above her head and waited. Damien was already inside. She got in. The city moved past the windows in streaks of neon and headlights. Nobody spoke for the first 3 minutes. Avery sat with her hands in her lap and her wedding gown bunched against the door, and she did not look at the man beside her. She was thinking about the footage, the specific quality of the edit, clean cuts, no jump artifacts, the color grading consistent across every frame. That kind of work required equipment and expertise that most people didn't have access to. It also required time. You didn't fabricate something like that in a week. "How long?" she said. Damien looked at her. "The footage. How long did it take to build something that clean?" He considered. "Weeks, minimum. More likely 2 months." She had been engaged for 7 months, which meant someone had started planning this before she and Grant had even set a date. She sat with that arithmetic and felt something cold work its way through her chest. Not grief, not anymore, but the particular chill of understanding that something you believed was real was constructed from the beginning. "Who knows we left together," she said. "My people." "How many people is that?" "Enough to do what needs doing. Few enough that it doesn't become a problem." He was watching her with that same level attention he'd had in the bar. Not sympathetic, not clinical. Something in between. "You're thinking about exposure. I'm thinking about the fact that I just got into a car with a man I met an hour ago based on a proposal that would have sounded like a con in any other context." "It would have sounded like a con in this context too," he said, "if you hadn't already decided it wasn't." She looked at him. "What makes you think I've decided anything?" "You got in the car." She turned back to the window. The Escalade had moved off Fremont and was heading north on a route she didn't know well, away from the Strip, away from the high-density tourist corridors, into the part of the city that existed on the other side of the postcard. Wider streets, older buildings, properties that looked unremarkable from the outside because they were meant to. "Where are we going?" she said. "Somewhere you can change out of that dress, and we can talk through the terms without an audience." "I don't have anything to change into." "That's been handled." She looked at him again. He was looking forward now, and the city light moved across his face in intervals, illuminated, shadowed, illuminated again. She thought about what it meant that he'd anticipated this detail, that somewhere in the past hour, someone in his organization had been dispatched to acquire clothing in her approximate size. It was either impressively efficient or deeply unsettling, and she hadn't yet decided which. The vehicle turned through a gate that opened before they reached it and pulled into the underground parking structure of a building with no visible signage. The kind of building that didn't need signage because the people who needed to find it already knew where it was. They took an elevator to the 8th floor. The space that opened when the doors parted was not what she expected. Not the aesthetic of money performing itself, not marble and gold fixtures and the aggressive luxury of men who needed you to register their wealth. It was spare. High ceilings, concrete floors, furniture that was expensive without being ornamental. The kind of space designed by someone who understood that restraint communicated more than excess. She hated that she noticed this. She hated that her brain was running professional assessments on the interior design of the place she'd just been brought to by a man whose last name had made her 3-second pause in a bar. A woman appeared from a hallway to the left. 50s, short hair, the manner of someone who had been competent for so long that competence had become simply her resting state. She was carrying folded clothing and a pair of shoes. "Miss Sinclair," she said, "I'm Rosa. I'll show you where you can change." Avery looked at Damien. "Terms in 20 minutes, he said. "Take whatever time you need." She followed Rosa. The bathroom was the size of a studio apartment she'd had at 22. She locked the door and sat on the edge of the tub in her wedding gown and put her face in her hands and allowed herself 60 seconds of the thing she had not allowed herself in the bar or in the car or on the steps of the Caldwell Grand. Not crying. She had meant what the dress implied. She was past the part that cried. But something adjacent. The full-body understanding of what had actually happened today. The specific weight of having built something, carefully and over years, and watched it taken apart in 40 seconds by people who had been planning it before the foundation was even poured. 60 seconds. She counted them. Then she stood up, unzipped the dress, stepped out of it, and left it on the floor. The clothes Rosa had brought were simple. Dark pants, a gray shirt, flat shoes that fit well enough. She rolled the sleeves and looked at herself in the mirror and recognized the face looking back. The same face that had stared down contractors and underbidding competitors and clients who didn't think a woman in her late 20s understood the difference between a load-bearing wall and a partition. The face that had learned to stay level when the room was trying to rattle it. She was still here. That was something. She unlocked the door and went to find Damien Moretti. He was in a room off the main space, a room with a long table, a wall of monitors currently dark, and 2 chairs facing each other across a narrow distance. A manila folder sat on the table. He was standing at the window when she came in, looking out at the city below. "Sit down," he said. "I'll stand." He turned from the window, looked at her for a moment, nodded once, accepting the modification. "The terms," he said, in plain language. "We file for a civil marriage license within 72 hours. Legal, registered, publicly verifiable. You become Avery Moretti on paper. In exchange, I deploy my investigative team, the people I use for due diligence on acquisitions, which means they are thorough and they are discreet, to establish the origin of the footage, identify every party involved in its production, and build a case capable of destroying Lenora Holloway's credibility permanently." "Capable of destroying," Avery said, "or guaranteed to." "Nothing is guaranteed. Capable of, if executed correctly." "And what do you get?" "What I said. A wife. Specifically a wife whose background is clean, whose professional reputation in this city is substantial enough to provide cover for certain transactions I need to conduct under a more domestic presentation. She watched him. What kind of transactions? Property acquisitions, business negotiations, events where a man in my position attending alone sends a signal I need to counteract. You want to look less like what you are. I want to look like a man whose priorities have evolved. He said it without apology. There are people in this city, legitimate business people, municipal officials, federal contacts, who will extend me latitude I currently don't have if I present as someone who has built a life beyond the family business. And a wife does that. The right wife does that. She was quiet for a moment. You said the Holloway family has been trying to acquire your properties. 3 of them. The approaches have been escalating. And Lenora Holloway is connected to Victor Sorrento. Something changed in the room, not visibly. He didn't move, his expression didn't shift, but the temperature of his attention changed. It sharpened. She felt it the way you feel a current in water before you see it move. Where did you hear that name? He said. You went still in the bar when you mentioned her, Avery said. A specific kind of still, like a man who just identified a threat. And you already knew the footage was fabricated and you knew Lenora's methodology. That's not due diligence on a property acquisition. That's surveillance on someone you consider an active problem. She kept her eyes on him. And then you said her name alongside someone else, or almost did, and stopped yourself. So I'm asking you directly. Who is Victor Sorrento? The pause was longer than any he'd allowed himself so far. He is the head of the Sorrento organization, Damien said, which has been in direct competition with my family's interests in this city for 11 years. Competition. War, he said. The word people use when they want to pretend the thing is contained. She absorbed this. So Lenora Holloway is connected to your primary enemy, allegedly. And you think she engineered my wedding disaster as an opening move in something larger. I think it's possible. I think investigating it is worth the cost of the arrangement I'm proposing. Because if she's working with Sorrento, Avery said slowly, working it through, then destroying my reputation wasn't just about getting me out of Grant's life. It was about something else. Yes. What? He looked at her steadily. That's what we need to find out. She stood in the spare, expensive room in clothes that weren't hers and looked at a man who was telling her partial truths with the careful precision of someone who had calibrated exactly how much information a situation required. She was aware that she was being managed. She was also aware that he was right. Her own investigation would take her nowhere. She had no leverage, no resources, no allies in the relevant world. He had all 3. She hated that the math was this clean. I want independent legal counsel, she said. Someone of my choosing, not yours. They review every document before I sign. Agreed. I want an exit clause. Specifically, if at any point I determine this arrangement places me in physical danger I did not consent to, I can dissolve the agreement unilaterally and receive full documentation of everything your team has found on the footage, regardless of whether the investigation is complete. He was quiet for a moment. Agreed, with one modification. What? If you exit mid-investigation, there are people who will become aware of your knowledge of certain things, people for whom that knowledge makes you dangerous. I want the right to provide security for 30 days post-exit, whether you want it or not. She looked at him. You think I'd be a target? I think association with me creates risks whether or not the association continues. The 30-day window is self-interest on my part, not generosity. She respected the honesty of that more than she expected to. Fine, she said. 30 days. But I approve the security arrangements. I won't have people in my space I didn't vet. You can interview them yourself. I will. She looked at the folder on the table. What's in there? Preliminary background. What my team assembled on the Holloway family in the past 18 months. He nodded at it. Read it before you make a final decision. She picked up the folder and opened it. She read for 11 minutes. Damien poured 2 glasses of water and set one beside her and didn't speak. She turned pages and the profile of Lenora Holloway assembled itself. Not the social performance of a grieving mother, but the operational record of a woman who had spent 3 decades moving money and influence through a network of relationships that looked philanthropic from the outside and looked like something else entirely when you trace the flow. Shell companies, property transfers at below market value, political donations structured to avoid disclosure thresholds, and at the center of a financial thread that ran through 4 different holding entities, a name that appeared 3 times in the past 2 years. Sorrento Holdings, LLC. She closed the folder. Her hands were steady. She was going to be angry about this later. The specific, white-hot anger of someone who has understood they were collateral in a conflict they didn't know existed. But not now. Now her brain was doing the thing it did on complicated projects, the thing that made her good at what she did. She was looking at the problem structurally, finding the load-bearing elements, identifying where pressure should be applied. "When do we file?" she said. Mars. The next 4 days were nothing like she expected. She had assumed that being inside Damien Moretti's world would feel like a siege, the constant weight of men with weapons, the oppressive theater of power. Instead, it felt like being inside a very efficient, very controlled corporation that happened to have an unusual risk profile. People moved through the compound, because that was what the property was, functionally, a compound on 12 acres at the northern edge of the city, with purpose and without fanfare. Nobody performed their authority. Nobody needed to. Rosa managed the domestic operation of the space with the same affect she'd shown the first night, unruffled, thorough, and consistently ahead of whatever needed to happen next. She showed Avery the space that had been designated as hers, a suite on the east side of the building with a sitting room, a bedroom, and a bathroom larger than the office she'd maintained for 2 years on West Sahara. She'd also organized a car service for Avery's use, independent of Damien's security detail. "I can go out," Avery said. It wasn't a question. "You can go wherever you need to go," Rosa said. "There will be 2 people with you. They'll stay back, but they'll be there." Avery thought about refusing this on principle and decided it wasn't the battle worth fighting today. On the second morning, she sat across a table from the attorney she'd selected, a woman named Patricia Osei, who ran a small firm downtown and had been recommended by a colleague with no connection to either the Holloways or the Morettis. Patricia read through the terms document for 40 minutes without speaking. Then she looked up. "The exit clause is actually solid," Patricia said. "Better than I expected. The financial structure is clean. You receive no money, which protects you from certain complications. The non-disclosure provisions are narrow enough to be enforceable without being punitive." She set the document down. "My concern is the ambiguity around what full documentation means at exit. I want that defined specifically." "Define it," Avery said. Patricia drafted language. Damien's lawyer, a man named Chen who wore glasses and said almost nothing, reviewed it for 20 minutes and came back with 2 modifications. Patricia accepted one and countered the other. By 4 in the afternoon, they had a document that said exactly what it meant. Avery signed it. Damien signed it. Patricia kept a copy. Chen kept a copy. Avery photographed every page with her phone and emailed it to an address she'd created that morning on a server she'd paid for independently. The marriage license took less time than the contract. On the 3rd day, Damien's lead investigator came to the compound. His name was Reyes, tall, maybe 40, with the kind of face that looked like it had been rearranged at least once and had healed imprecisely. He set a laptop on the table in the room with the monitors and walked Avery and Damien through what his team had found. The footage originated from a camera installed in the Henderson Hotel 14 weeks before the wedding. Not a hotel security camera, a custom device, mounted inside a smoke detector housing in the corridor outside the elevator bank. Professional installation. The device had been removed after the footage was extracted, but the mounting hardware had been left behind, and Reyes had a contact in the Henderson PD who'd pulled the maintenance log. The smoke detector housing had been replaced 6 weeks before it was installed, meaning someone had planned the installation at least 2 weeks ahead of that. 16 weeks out, Avery said. At minimum, Reyes confirmed. I met Marcus Webb at a trade conference 20 weeks ago. He contacted me 3 weeks later about the redesign project. She was doing the math. Someone identified him as a potential asset before he even reached out to me. Which means they were watching you, Damien said. Or watching him, Reyes said. Webb has a profile. 3 business disputes in 2 years, 2 of which involved allegations of impropriety that went nowhere. He's the kind of person who looks useful in retrospect. Avery stared at the screen. The footage paused on a frame. Her face, Webb's face, the narrow distance between them that looked like everything it wasn't. She had spent 4 minutes in that corridor. 14 weeks of preparation for 4 minutes. The edited file, she said. Who produced it? We're tracing the software signature. There's a specific render artifact in the cut transitions that our guy says comes from one of 3 editing suites in the city equipped with the relevant software. 2 are commercial facilities. 1 is private. Reyes paused. The private facility is registered to a holding company. The holding company traces back to Sorrento Holdings, Avery said. The room went quiet. Reyes looked at Damien. Damien was looking at Avery. The expression on his face was the most unguarded thing she had seen from him since the bar. Not alarm, but the particular focused attention of a man recalibrating his assessment of someone. Yeah, Reyes said. How'd you know? The folder he gave me the first night. She looked at Damien. You already suspected. I suspected a connection, he said. I didn't have a chain of evidence until now. And now you do. She turned back to Reyes. Can you tie the editing facility directly to the production of this specific footage? Working on it. Give me 4 more days. You have 2, Damien said. Reyes looked at him without expression. 3, he said, and left. In the silence after the door closed, Avery said, He pushes back on you. He's worth keeping for exactly that reason. She stood and walked to the wall of monitors. Still dark. She could see her own reflection in the nearest screen. Someone who looked like herself but was standing in a room she hadn't known existed a week ago, inside an arrangement she would not have predicted with a gun to her head 48 hours before that. The Sorrento connection changes things, she said. Yes. This wasn't about Grant, or about you. This was a specific move against Lenore Holloway's. She stopped. Worked through it. No, that's not right either. She turned. Lenora Holloway wanted me gone from Grant's life. That part was real, but she didn't manufacture a connection to Sorrento for this. She already had one, which means she offered my destruction as a service. To someone who had a use for the chaos. Damien was very still. What use? She said. What does Victor Sorrento gain from my public humiliation at a wedding? On its own? Nothing. His voice was level. But if that public humiliation caused a reaction from someone in attendance who had a specific reason to care about your welfare, then the wedding was a diagnostic, not just an act of destruction, a test of response. She felt it land. He was watching to see who came after me. Or who didn't, Damien said. She stared at him. Were you supposed to come after me? The pause was half a second too long. There are things I need to tell you, he said, about why I was in that bar, about what my family owes yours. But not tonight. Tonight there are... His phone buzzed. He looked at it. The change in his face was minimal, a slight tightening around the jaw, a shift in the quality of his stillness from controlled to alert. What? She said. He turned the phone so she could see the screen. The message was 3 words from a number with no name attached. She knows everything. Avery looked at the message, then at Damien. Who is she? He was already moving toward the door. Rosa, he said. Get Reyes back on the phone. Then he looked at Avery over his shoulder, and for the first time since the bar, she saw something in his face that looked less like management and more like a man standing at the edge of a decision he'd been postponing. Someone inside this building, he said, has been feeding information to Victor Sorrento. The sentence landed in the room like something structural giving way. How long? She said. I don't know yet. He held her gaze. But they know you're here. They know what Reyes found. And if Sorrento knows what we know, then the timeline just collapsed. He pushed the door open. We have hours, not days, before he moves. Avery didn't hesitate. Then move faster. She followed him into the main room where Rosa was already on the phone, voice low and clipped, her unruffled competence now carrying an edge that hadn't been there before. Two men Avery had seen in the corridors were positioned near the building's entrance without anyone visibly summoning them. The compound had shifted registers. The same people, the same spaces, but the air pressure had changed. Reyes came back through the door 11 minutes later. He had his jacket on and his jaw set, and he looked at Damien without preamble. "Chen," he said. One word. It hit the room like a round through glass. Damien didn't move. "You're certain?" His access log shows 3 external transfers in the past 48 hours. Encrypted, routed through a bounce server in Phoenix. Our guy cracked the routing 20 minutes ago. Reyes set a tablet on the table. Last transfer was 90 minutes ago, 40 minutes after we finished the briefing. Avery looked at the tablet. Transfer timestamps, file sizes. And at the end of the routing chain, a receiving address traced to a server registered in the name of a logistics company out of Henderson, Nevada. The same city where a camera had been installed inside a smoke detector 14 weeks before her wedding. Damien looked at the tablet for a long time. Then he said, "Where is he now?" "Still in the building, East Wing. He doesn't know we have the log." The silence that followed was the kind that precedes something irreversible. Avery had felt silences like this on job sites when a structural assessment came back wrong. The moment before everyone in the room accepted that the plan had to change completely. She looked at Damien. His face was closed in a way she hadn't seen before. Not cold, but sealed. The way a room is sealed when what's inside it is too volatile for open air. "Chen reviewed my exit clause," she said quietly. "He knows the specific language. He knows what documentation I'd walk away with." Damien looked at her. "Yes. So Sorrento knows exactly what I have and what I'd have if I left." She held his gaze. "Which means leaving doesn't make me safer. It makes me a loose end." "Yes," he said again. The word cost him something. She could see it. She picked up the tablet and looked at the transfer log one more time. 14 weeks of planning to destroy her. A mole embedded inside the one place she'd been told was secure. A man named Sorrento, who had used her wedding as a diagnostic and was now watching to see what she'd do next. She set the tablet down. "Then we don't give him the answer he's expecting," she said. Damien looked at her, really looked, the way he had in the bar when he'd said she wasn't hoping for rescue anymore. Something in his expression shifted. Not softening. Recognition. "No," he said. "We don't." Outside, Las Vegas burned on without them, indifferent and bright. And somewhere in the east wing of the compound, a man named Chen was still sitting with his phone, not yet knowing that the war had just changed shape entirely. They found Chen in the east wing sitting room with a glass of water and a book open on his lap. And the performance of it, the studied normalcy of a man reading at 9:40 in the evening while the compound recalibrated around him, was so precise that Avery understood immediately he had known they were coming and had decided to meet it exactly this way. Damien walked in first. Reyes positioned himself at the door without being told. Avery came in behind Damien and stood to his left, and Chen looked up from the book with an expression of mild inquiry that would have been convincing to someone who hadn't just read his access log. "We need to talk," Damien said. Chen set the book down, closed it carefully, spine up, marking his place, the gesture of a man who intended to return to it. "Of course," he said. The room was small. 2 chairs, a side table, a lamp throwing warm light that felt wrong for what was happening. Damien remained standing. Avery remained standing. Chen was the only one seated, which should have made him the vulnerable party in the geometry of the room, but he sat with a stillness that mirrored Damien's own, and watching the two of them, Avery thought, these are men who learned composure from the same school, the same brutal curriculum of never letting a room see you break. "The transfers," Damien said. Chen said nothing. 3 of them in 48 hours, routed through Phoenix, received by a server registered to a Sorrento-adjacent entity in Henderson. Damien's voice was even. No heat. That was what made it frightening. "The last one 90 minutes ago." Chen looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Avery. His gaze was assessing in a way that made her skin prickle. Not threatening, but calibrating, like a man deciding how much a variable would affect an outcome. How much do you actually know? Chen said. Not to Damien. To her. Avery held his gaze. Enough. That's not an answer. It's the only one you're getting from me. Something shifted in Chen's expression. Not respect exactly, but an adjustment, an upward revision. He looked back at Damien. How long have you had the log? Long enough. Then you know I didn't encrypt the routing to hide it permanently. I encrypted it to buy time. Chen leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and for the first time the composed performance showed a seam. Not guilt, but urgency. The urgency of a man who needs to be believed and knows he's working against the accumulated weight of evidence. I'm not feeding Sorrento. I'm feeding a federal task force that has been embedded inside Sorrento's financial network for 8 months. My contact is an agent named Draper. The Phoenix server is a federal relay. The room went absolutely still. Damien did not move. His face did not move. But Avery watched his hands, and the tendons along his right hand shifted. A single, involuntary response that lasted less than a second and told her everything about how hard that landing hit. You're a federal asset, Damien said. I have been for 4 years, Chen said, since before I came to work for you. The arrangement was in place before the arrangement with you was. Who knows? On your side? No one. That was the condition. Chen's voice was steady, but the urgency was still there, still pressing at the edges of every word. On the federal side, Draper and 2 members of his team. The task force is targeting Sorrento's money pipeline. I've been inside that pipeline through my work for you for 4 years, and we are 3 months from having enough to dismantle it entirely. 3 months, Reyes said from the door. It was the first thing he'd said since they came in. His voice carried a specific quality, the flat effect of a man deciding whether to believe something or not. 3 months, Chen confirmed. He looked at Damien again. The transfers in the past 48 hours were case-relevant material. The routing chain you cracked. Sorrento's people built it. Draper's team needed the architecture documented before we move on the financial network. I used the window your investigation opened. He paused. I didn't anticipate Reyes would crack the routing this fast. You should have, Reyes said. Yes, Chen said. I should have.
He
He said it without deflection, which was the thing that made it most credible. The admission of the specific error without apology for the larger choice. Damien turned away from Chen and walked to the window. His back was to the room. Avery watched him and did not speak. This was not her history with this man. This was 11 years of operational trust, discovering it had been built on a foundation that was also something else. She understood the physics of that. She had stood in the ballroom at the Caldwell Grand 4 days ago and felt the floor change under her feet. She understood floors that changed. Verify it, Damien said, still facing the window. Tonight. I want Draper's credentials, the task force designation, and the contact protocol. If it checks out, he stopped. Something in his posture shifted, a slow rotation of weight, the recalibration of a man absorbing a new structural reality. If it checks out, we talk about what comes next. Chen nodded. He picked up his phone. Reyes looked at Damien's back, then at Avery. She read the look. He didn't know what to do with this any more than the rest of them did. She gave him nothing back because she had nothing to give. She was standing in the room where the plan they'd had for 48 hours had just been disassembled, and she was already trying to see the new shape of what remained. Draper checked out. It took Reyes 2 hours and 4 phone calls to verify the task force designation, the federal relay server, and the identity of the agent operating under the name Draper. He came back into the main room at 11:50 with a single sheet of printed confirmation and set it on the table in front of Damien without comment. Damien read it, folded it once, set it down. Get Chen, he said. They sat, all 4 of them, around the table in the monitor room, and what followed was the most disorienting conversation Avery had been part of in a week that had already broken every prior record. Chen talked for 40 minutes. The federal case against Victor Sorrento's financial network was substantial. 8 months of documented money movement through 17 shell entities, 3 of which intersected with Lenora Holloway's holding structure in ways that made the Sorrento-Holloway connection not an alliance of convenience, but a long-term operational relationship spanning at least 6 years. 6 years. Avery had met Grant Holloway at an industry event 3 years ago. She had been a detail in a plan that was already running before she existed in it. "The wedding," she said, cutting across something Chen was saying about the money pipeline. "The footage, the public destruction, where does that fit in the federal case?" Chen looked at her. "It doesn't. Yet. But if we can tie the editing facility to Sorrento's network, which your investigator was apparently close to doing, 2 days," Reyes said. "Then it becomes evidence of operational coordination between Sorrento and the Holloways that predates the financial crimes. It strengthens the case for conspiracy charges against Lenora specifically." Chen paused. "Which is why the timing of Sorrento's response to your investigation matters. He didn't panic when you found the camera installation. He panicked when Reyes got close to the editing facility." "Because the editing facility is the link," Avery said. "It's the link that puts Lenora inside the criminal conspiracy instead of adjacent to it." Chen looked at Damien. "Which means Sorrento is going to move to close that link before we can document it. The facility, the equipment, the people who used it." "How long?" Damien said. "Hours? Maybe less. He knows we have the routing chain. He knows how close Reyes is." Reyes was already on his phone. Avery looked at the dark monitors on the wall. She was thinking about the editing facility in Henderson, about a server in Phoenix, about a smoke detector housing in a hotel corridor, and 16 weeks of planning and a 40-second video that had ended her life as she knew it, and apparently also functioned as evidence in a federal criminal case she hadn't known existed until 11 minutes ago. She was thinking about the layers, how many layers there were, how far back they went, how many decisions had been made about her life by people who'd never spoken to her. And then she thought about something Chen had said. 6 years. "Damien," she said. He looked at her. "You said you needed to tell me something, about why you were in the bar, about what your family owes mine." She held his gaze. "Chen just told us Sorrento's relationship with the Holloways goes back 6 years, which means whatever they were building was already running when your grandfather was still alive." Something happened in Damien's face. The same seam she'd seen in Chen's composure 20 minutes ago, the place where the controlled surface showed what was under it, briefly, before closing again. "Yes," he said. "Tell me now." The room was quiet. Reyes was still on the phone but had turned toward the wall, giving them what passed for privacy. Chen looked at the table. Damien was quiet for a moment that stretched. Then he said, "Your father's name was Robert Sinclair. He worked construction project management. 23 years ago, he was on a site in North Las Vegas that my grandfather also had reason to be on. An acquisition that was being contested at the time, the kind of contest that involved people with weapons rather than lawyers. There was an incident. Your father intervened when he had no obligation to and every reason not to. My grandfather would not have walked away from that site without him." Avery absorbed this. Her father had died 11 years ago. Cardiac failure at 58, quiet and fast, the kind of death that didn't leave room for the conversations you'd been postponing. She thought about him, the actual man, the person she'd known, his preference for early mornings and bad coffee, and the way he'd always been slightly more comfortable on a construction site than anywhere else. She had never known this about him, had never known he'd been on a site like that, in a situation like that, had never known her father's 4 minutes of decision had echoed for 23 years. "He never told you," Damien said, watching her face. "No. My grandfather told my father. My father told me. It was carried like a debt." He paused. "When my people identified your engagement to Grant Holloway 8 months ago, Grant Holloway, whose mother was already inside our intelligence picture as a Sorrento-adjacent entity, I had a choice about whether to intervene or observe. 8 months. She had gotten engaged 8 months ago. You've been watching me for 8 months, she said, watching to determine if the threat was real, if Lenora was genuinely targeting you, or if your presence in the Holloway family was incidental to her operations. And what did you determine? That you were not incidental. His voice was even. That Lenora identified your value to Grant early and made a decision to neutralize you before you became permanent. The footage was the implementation of a plan she'd been building since before your engagement was announced. Avery stood up. She walked to the window the way Damien had earlier and looked out at the city. Her hands were flat at her sides. She was running the arithmetic. 8 months of surveillance, her engagement, Lenora's timeline, the camera installation 16 weeks out, and somewhere underneath all of it, the fact of her father on a construction site 23 years ago making a choice that had apparently determined the shape of her life in ways he'd never known and never told her. You didn't tell me this the first night, she said. No. Or the second. No. She turned from the window. Why? Because I needed you to agree to the arrangement before I told you, or you would have believed the arrangement was built on obligation rather than mutual benefit. An obligation is not a foundation that holds under pressure. She looked at him across the room. The anger was there, real and specific. The anger of someone who has been managed even by the person who is supposedly helping them. But underneath, it was something more complicated. The understanding that he wasn't wrong. If he had led with her father's story, she would have spent every subsequent decision wondering whether she was being protected or paid off. She would have been looking at the wrong thing. He had known that. He had made a calculation about her psychology, and he had been correct, and she hated that most of all. We're going to have a significant conversation about what you're allowed to withhold from me, she said. Yes, he said. We are. Reyes came off the phone. The facility in Henderson, he said. My contact just drove past. It's dark. Loading dock is open and there's a truck. Everyone in the room understood what that meant. They're clearing it, Avery said. Right now, Reyes confirmed. Damien was already moving. How long to get there? 22 minutes if we go now. Go! The next 4 minutes were the organized chaos of a team that had done urgent things before. Reyes on the phone coordinating, Rosa appearing from nowhere with a go bag that Damien took without breaking stride, 2 of the compound's security detail falling into position at the vehicle entrance. Avery was in the Escalade before she'd consciously decided to be, and when Damien looked at her from the other side of the vehicle with a question in his expression, she said, I'm going, and his expression closed the question without argument. The city at midnight moved differently than the city at 9. Fewer tourists on the thoroughfares, more vehicles that belonged to the city's other economy, the one that ran on the infrastructure tourists never saw. The Escalade moved fast, and Reyes was on the phone the whole way, giving instructions to someone who was apparently already near the facility. They were 14 minutes out when Reyes's phone buzzed differently. A single buzz, the specific register of a text rather than a call. He looked at it. His face did something. What? Damien said. Reyes turned the phone. A photograph, taken from a distance with a long lens. The inside of the Henderson facility, visible through the open loading dock doors. The truck. 3 men loading equipment, and standing to one side, watching the operation with his arms crossed, and the particular ease of a man who owns everything in his field of vision. A man in his 60s. Silver hair, heavy build, the kind of face that had been handsome once and had since become something harder and more functional. And standing beside him, her hand on his arm, in the clothes she'd been wearing at a wedding 5 days ago, Lenora Holloway. Avery stared at the photograph. The image was clear enough to read body language. Not the body language of an ally being briefed, but of a woman who had arrived somewhere she belonged. Her posture was different from every version of Lenora Avery had ever seen. No performance, no rehearsed grief, no careful social calibration. She was relaxed, she was comfortable, she was home. That's him, Damien said. His voice had gone to a register Avery hadn't heard before, flat and specific and very quiet. That's Victor Sorrento. They're together, Reyes said. They've been together, Damien said. That's not a working relationship. Look at her. Avery was looking. She was thinking about Grant. Grant, who had stood at that altar with a rehearsed smile and aimed gesture at the back of the room. Grant, who had a mother he presumably believed he knew. Grant, who was somewhere in this city tonight, unaware that the woman who raised him was standing in a warehouse in Henderson, watching men load the evidence of her crimes into a truck with her hand resting on the arm of a man who was not his father. "How long have they—" she started. "I don't know," Damien said, "but long enough that this wasn't business. This was cover." He was looking at the photograph with the focused stillness of someone assembling a structure from its components. She wasn't working with Sorrento. She was working for him. Everything the Holloway name represented, the social legitimacy, the political connections, the property network, all of it was infrastructure for his operation. Grant was infrastructure. The word landed in the vehicle like a struck bell. Avery thought about Grant, about the man she had agreed to marry. Whatever she felt about him now, whatever the betrayal of the footage, had burned into her understanding of who he was. She had not until this moment considered that he might also be a victim. That the mother who had pressed a dry handkerchief to her face in the front row of the Caldwell Grand might have been running a performance for him too, for his entire life, and he might not know it any more than Avery had known about her father on a construction site 23 years ago. The Escalade was 8 minutes from the facility when Reyes took another call. He listened for 45 seconds. His face went through a sequence of small adjustments that Avery had learned in 5 days to read as the controlled expression of a man receiving bad news in a professional context. "Say it," Damien said. "They got the equipment out," Reyes said. "Truck left the facility 7 minutes ago. My contact couldn't intercept without—" He paused. "But they left someone behind." "Who?" "He doesn't have a name, young guy. 20s, zip-tied to a support column in the back of the facility." Reyes looked at Damien. "He's been there for a while. My contact says he's been beaten. Not badly, but enough." Another pause. "He had a wallet on him. My contact ran the ID." Reyes turned the phone around again. Nevada driver's license. The photograph on it showed a young man, maybe 24, with a square jaw and clean features that would have read as trustworthy in a photograph. The name on the license was Grant Holloway. Avery's breath stopped in her chest. "He's alive," Reyes said quickly. "My contact says he's coherent, but whatever Grant Holloway knew or figured out about his mother's operation, Sorrento decided tonight was the night to stop him from telling anyone about it." Avery was out of the Escalade before it fully stopped. The facility was a converted warehouse. Low ceilings, concrete floor, the smell of industrial solvent, and something older underneath it. Emergency lighting only, casting everything in a yellow-gray wash that made the space look like a photograph of itself. Reyes's contact, a compact man in a dark jacket who introduced himself as nobody, led them through the cleared-out main floor toward the back. Grant was zip-tied to a structural column with his hands behind him and his head forward. And when Avery came around the column and crouched to his eye level, he looked up at her with an expression she had not expected and could not immediately name. Not shame, not relief, something rawer than either. The specific face of a man who has spent several hours alone with what he knows and has not yet decided what to do with it. His left eye was swollen. There was dried blood below his lip. He looked at her for a long moment and said nothing. "Can you walk?" she said. "Yes." His voice was rough. Reyes cut the zip ties. Grant brought his arms forward slowly, the movement of someone working through serious stiffness, and pressed his hands against his knees and breathed. Damien stood 6 feet back and watched without speaking. Grant looked up at him. Something passed between the two men, not recognition exactly, but the acknowledgement of a situation too specific to require explanation. "She told me you took Avery," Grant said to Damien, "that you'd use the wedding to get access to her." He stopped, worked his jaw carefully. "I went to the facility to find evidence, to bring it to the police." A pause. "They were already there." "How much do you know?" Damien said. Grant looked at Avery. The raw thing in his expression sharpened into something that cost him visibly to hold. "I know the footage was fake," he said. "I found the original files on her laptop 3 days after the wedding. I know she built it. I know she's been... He stopped again. I've known something was wrong for 2 years. I didn't know what it was. Avery looked at the man she had agreed to marry, the man who had stood at an altar and destroyed her in front of 500 people. She looked at his swollen eye and his careful breathing and the expression on his face of someone who had just watched the architecture of his entire life crack along fault lines he hadn't known were there. She understood that feeling precisely. "Can you testify," she said, "to what you found, to what you know?" Grant met her eyes. "Yes," he said. The word was quiet and absolute, and it changed the shape of everything that came next. Damien looked at Reyes. Reyes was already on the phone. Outside, Las Vegas kept burning, indifferent as ever. But somewhere in the city, Victor Sorrento was moving his evidence and believing he had won, and he did not yet know that the man he'd left zip-tied to a column had just become the most dangerous witness alive. They moved Grant out of the facility in under 4 minutes. Reyes had a vehicle 2 blocks over. Not the Escalade, a different car, older and unremarkable. The kind that disappeared into Las Vegas street traffic without requiring any effort. Grant got in without being asked. He moved carefully, favoring his left side where someone had hit him with something harder than a fist, and he didn't speak during the drive back, and nobody asked him to. Avery sat beside him in the back seat and watched the city move past the window and ran the arithmetic of what they had and what they needed and how much time they didn't have. What they had? Grant's testimony. The routing chain from Chen's transfers. Reyes's documentation of the camera installation in Henderson. The financial thread connecting Lenora Holloway's holding structure to Sorrento Holdings across 6 years of transactions. Chen's 4 years of federal intelligence. And Draper's task force, 3 months from a case that was now running out of runway because Sorrento knew he was exposed. What they needed, the editing facility's equipment. The truck that had left the warehouse 7 minutes before they arrived. What they had instead of time, hours, maybe less. Back at the compound, Rosa had a medical kit in the manner of someone who had used one before in non-standard circumstances. She looked at Grant's eye and his ribs without comment, and taped 2 of the ribs and gave him something for the swelling, and he took it without argument, which told Avery more about how much pain he was in than anything else would have. Damien pulled Reyes into the monitor room. Avery followed. Grant, after a moment's hesitation in the hallway, followed too, and nobody told him not to. The monitors were live now. Reyes had his team feeding footage from traffic cameras across the northeast corridor of the city, the direction the truck had gone based on his contact's sighting. On the 3rd monitor from the left, a vehicle matching the description was visible on a camera feed from a gas station on the 95, timestamped 19 minutes old. "They're heading to the Sorrento compound," Damien said. Not a question. "The main property is in Boulder City," Reyes said. 40 minutes from here. Gated, 12-foot perimeter, private security. Last count my people did was 8 months ago. 14 on-site personnel. "It'll be more tonight," Damien said. "He knows we found the facility. He'll have pulled people in." 20, maybe 25. Reyes looked at the monitor. "If that equipment reaches the compound, it's gone. He'll destroy it tonight." Grant spoke from the doorway. "There's a secondary property." Everyone looked at him. He was leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed over his taped ribs and his swollen eye and the expression of a man who had decided something during the drive. "Boulder City is the residence, but there's a facility, commercial front, registered as a media production company, on the east side of Henderson. Different from the warehouse, it's where he runs the technical operations." He paused. "My mother had files on it. I photographed them before she knew I'd found them." He held up his phone. On the screen was a photograph of a document, an address, a floor plan sketched by hand, notation in Lenora Holloway's precise handwriting indicating camera positions and entry points, and the location of a server room on the building's 2nd floor. The room was quiet for 3 seconds. "When did you take this?" Damien said. 8 days ago, Grant said. 2 days before the wedding. He held Damien's gaze without flinching. "I didn't know what it meant then. I thought she was... I didn't know. But I kept it." Avery looked at the phone, then at Grant, the specific cost of what he was doing, standing in the compound of the man his mother had told him was the enemy, handing over intelligence that implicated her in a federal criminal conspiracy, was visible in every line of his body. He wasn't doing it cleanly. It was costing him in real time, and he was doing it anyway. The server room, she said. If the editing files were transferred digitally before they cleared the warehouse, they'd route through the main server, Grant said. She told me once that Victor never moves originals without creating redundant copies first. It's how he operates. The warehouse equipment was the physical evidence. The files are somewhere on that network. Reyes was already pulling up the address on his laptop. Damien looked at the floor plan on Grant's phone for a long moment. Then he looked at Avery. The camera positions your mother noted, he said to Grant, but he was watching Avery. What do you see? She took the phone, looked at the sketch. Lenora's notation was precise. The habits of a woman who had learned operational detail from someone who took it seriously. Camera 1 at the main entrance, wide angle. Camera 2 covering the east corridor. Camera 3 positioned at the stairwell landing. Camera 4 at the server room door. But Lenora had also noted in smaller writing in the margin the phrase blind corner northwest stairwell. Confirm. There's a blind spot, Avery said. Northwest stairwell. She wasn't certain it was still there. She wrote confirm, which means it was there at some point, and she wasn't sure they'd closed it. She looked up. If the building follows standard commercial construction for that block, and I know that block, I bid on a renovation 2 years ago for a property 3 doors down, the northwest stairwell accesses the second floor from the exterior loading area, separate from the main entrance. You can get to the server room through the blind corner, Reyes said, if it's still blind. She handed the phone back to Grant. Someone would need to confirm it before committing to entry. I can confirm it, Damien said. You can't go in there yourself. No, he agreed. But I can go close enough to see whether the stairwell exterior is covered. He said it with the simplicity of a man describing an errand. Reyes takes a team to the main entrance as a diversion. I go to the northwest corner with 2 people. If the blind spot exists, we go in through the stairwell while Sorrento's security is oriented toward the front. And if the blind spot doesn't exist, Avery said, then we adapt. She looked at him. The word adapt was doing an enormous amount of work in that sentence, and they both knew it. Chen, Damien said. Chen was in the doorway now, had been for the past minute, listening. Get Draper on the phone. If we retrieve those files tonight, his task force gets everything. But I need him to have a team ready to move on the Sorrento compound in Boulder City simultaneously. If Victor is at the Henderson facility, the Boulder City property is vulnerable. If he's at Boulder City, he's at Henderson, Grant said. Everyone looked at him again. He was looking at the floor with the focused expression of someone working through memory. The warehouse operation tonight. He wouldn't delegate that, not with what's at stake. He'd run it personally. He looked up. He's at Henderson. I'd bet everything on it. You already are, Reyes said. Not cruel, just accurate. Grant absorbed this without response. Damien reached for his jacket. 40 minutes to get into position. Reyes, I want the diversion team staged before we move on the stairwell. No contact until I confirm the blind spot. He looked at Avery. You stay here with Rosa and... I know the building layout, she said. Avery, 3 doors down 2 years ago. I walked that block 4 times doing pre-bid assessment. I know where the northwest stairwell exits at street level, and I know what the sightlines look like from the east side of the loading area. She held his gaze. You need someone who can read the approach in real time. Reyes is running the diversion team. Your security people are capable, but they don't have the spatial instinct for... This isn't a construction site. No, it's a building. Buildings are what I do. She picked up her jacket from the chair back. I stay in the vehicle. I talk you through the approach. If the sightlines are wrong, I tell you before you're committed. The silence between them lasted 4 seconds. She counted. Vehicle, he said. You stay in the vehicle. Until you need me not to, she said. He held her gaze for a moment that had more in it than either of them addressed. Then he turned to the room. Move. Henderson at 1 in the morning was quiet in the particular way of industrial corridors. Not empty, but stripped of the civilian layer, reduced to the functional geography of loading routes and access roads and the occasional vehicle that belonged to the city's nocturnal logistics. The production company occupied a two-story commercial building on a block of similar structures, unremarkable from the street, its signage dark, 3 vehicles in the lot that Reyes's drive-by had clocked 20 minutes earlier. The vehicle Avery was in, a different car again, a gray sedan this time, was parked on the north side of the block with a sightline to the northwest corner of the building. Damien was in the back seat beside her. 2 of his security people were in front. Reyes and his team were staged on the south side, 4 people, waiting for the signal. Avery had Lenora's floor plan photograph on her phone and the memory of 2 years ago in her head. The walkthrough of the block, the way the buildings sat on their lots, the specific geometry of the northwest corner of this structure, which she had looked at while considering whether the renovation 3 doors down would create noise and access conflicts during construction. The stairwell exit is set back 4 feet from the building's northwest corner, she said quietly. If the camera coverage follows the notation, the east-facing camera on the stairwell landing covers the door from inside. But the exterior approach, the last 10 feet before you reach the door, that's where the blind spot would be, if it exists. The building's corner creates a natural occlusion. Occlusion, one of the security people in the front said. Shadow, she said. A gap in what the camera can see. Damien was looking at the building. His face in the dark car was very still, and she could feel the quality of his attention, the total orientation of a man committing the terrain to memory before he moved through it. The 3 vehicles in the lot, he said. Position. 2 near the main entrance, 1 near the loading dock on the south side. Reyes's voice came through the earpiece Damien was wearing. No movement in the past 8 minutes, but there are lights on the second floor. Server room is active. How many people inside? Damien said. We count 4 heat signatures from the exterior. Could be more deeper in the building. Victor. Can't confirm from here. Damien looked at Avery. Talk me to the corner. Go north along the building line. Stay inside the parked vehicles until you're level with the 3rd car from the end. That puts you in the loading dock shadow. From there, it's 12 feet to the corner. Move along the wall face, not perpendicular to it. The camera on the east corridor won't reach the exterior wall if you're flush against it. He nodded once, looked at the 2 security people. Keene comes with me. Torres, hold the vehicle. He looked at Avery. If anything changes in what you can see from here, I'll tell you. If I stop responding, Chassé, I'll tell Reyes. Another moment. That same weight in it. Then he opened the door and was gone, and Keene after him, and the door closed with the soft click of a well-maintained vehicle, and Avery was alone in the back seat with Torres's eyes in the mirror and the phone in her hand in the building's northwest corner, 60 feet away. She watched them move. Damien was good at this in the way that people who have been doing something dangerous for a long time become good at it. Not dramatic, not aggressive, just efficient. He moved along the vehicle line without urgency, which was the right choice, urgency being the thing that caught peripheral attention. Keene matched his pace exactly. They reached the loading dock shadow and paused, and Avery watched the building's second-floor window, and the window didn't change. You're in the shadow, she said quietly. Torres relayed it through the earpiece. Corner is 12 feet, wall on your left. They moved, 8 feet, 10. The corner. Damien's voice in Torres's earpiece relayed to Avery. Confirm the blind spot. She held her breath. It's there, he said. Stairwell door is in full occlusion from this position. We're going in, she exhaled. Then the building's south side exploded with light and sound as Reyes's diversion hit the main entrance. Not weapons, not yet, but vehicles and noise and the specific orchestrated chaos of a team that knew how to make 4 people sound like 12. The lot lights snapped on. Through the sedan's windshield, Avery watched 2 figures emerge from the main entrance at a run, heading toward the south side, which meant the interior had just lost at least 2 of its 4 heat signatures from the ground floor. Reyes, she said to Torres, 2 moving to you from the main entrance. Torres relayed it. She heard Reyes's acknowledgement. She watched the northwest corner. Nothing moved there. Damien and Keene were inside. The next 6 minutes were the longest of her life. She watched the building. The second floor lights stayed on. The south side noise continued to controlled, sustained, designed to hold attention without triggering a response that would bring in outside authorities before Draper's team was in position. Her phone showed the time in the corner of the screen, and she watched it change with the specific patience of someone who has learned that watching time doesn't slow it. 4 minutes in, a fifth heat signature appeared on the building's south face. A person exiting through a side door, moving fast, heading not toward the disturbance but away from it. North, toward the street where Avery's vehicle was parked. "Torres," she said, "I see it." The figure was moving with purpose, not panicked, directed. The specific movement of someone who has been told where to go in exactly this situation and is executing the instruction. He was 50 feet away. 40. He was wearing dark clothing and his face was turned down, and in the sodium glow of the street lighting, Avery could not see his features, but she could see his build. Heavy, broad through the shoulders, the body of a man in his 60s who had maintained physical power past the point where most people stopped. Torres was out of the vehicle before she processed what she was seeing. The two of them, Torres and the broad-shouldered man, came together on the sidewalk 20 feet from the sedan in a collision that was less a confrontation than a controlled stop, Torres using the door of a parked truck as a geometric advantage. The other man's forward momentum meeting resistance he hadn't anticipated. The man looked up. Victor Sorrento, 63 years old, silver-haired, with a face that had been handsome once and had since become a record of every decision he'd made. He looked at Torres, then past Torres through the sedan's windshield at Avery. He looked at her for 3 seconds. She didn't look away. Then Damien's voice came through Torres's earpiece loud enough that she heard it from the back seat. "We have the server. Draper, move now." And an instant later, from the south side of the building, the sound of Reyes's team changing register. No longer diversion, now containment. The difference audible even from here. Victor Sorrento heard it too. She watched him hear it. The slight adjustment of his head, the intake of breath, the specific moment when a man understands that the terrain has changed, and his position in it is no longer what he calculated. He looked at Avery again through the windshield. "Smart woman," he said. His voice carried even through the glass. Not a compliment. The acknowledgement of an opponent, offered with the bare economy of a man who didn't waste words even at the end. Torres had his arm. Two of Reyes's people appeared from the south side at a run. And somewhere above them on the second floor of a building in Henderson, Nevada, Damien Moretti was standing in a server room with a copy of every file Victor Sorrento had spent weeks trying to destroy. And on the other end of a phone line, a federal agent named Draper was giving his team the order that had been 3 months and 4 years and 11 years in the making. Avery Sinclair sat in the back of a gray sedan and watched Victor Sorrento's expression complete its journey from calculation to understanding. And she thought about 40 seconds of footage, and a smoke detector in a hotel corridor, and her father on a construction site 23 years ago, and the specific weight of a decision made in 4 minutes that echoes across a lifetime. Then the sedan's back door opened and Damien was there, breathing hard for the first time since she'd met him, a drive in his hand and blood on his jacket, from a cut above his ear he hadn't mentioned, and he looked at Victor Sorrento restrained on the sidewalk, and then he looked at Avery, and she looked back at him, and neither of them said anything because the moment had too much in it for words to do it justice. Damien got in. The door closed. His breathing was evening out. She could hear it, the deliberate rhythm of a man pulling himself back from the edge of exertion, and she watched his profile in the cut above his ear that was tracking a thin line of blood down to his jaw, and she reached across and pressed the hem of her sleeve against it without thinking. He didn't flinch. He didn't pull away. He let her hold it there and looked out the windshield at the scene resolving itself on the sidewalk. "Keen," he said. "He's good," Torres said from the front. "Minor. Draper's people are 90 seconds out." As if the word summoned them, 2 unmarked vehicles came hard around the south corner of the block. Federal plates, 4 agents in tactical gear, moving with the efficiency of a team that had been staged and waiting for exactly this signal. Draper himself was the second one out of the lead vehicle. Shorter than she'd imagined, quick-moving, the face of a man running on proximity to something he'd been building toward for a very long time. He looked at Victor Sorrento on the sidewalk, then at Damien in the sedan. The look between them carried the specific weight of two men who had been moving through the same territory from opposite directions and had arrived at the same point without ever having agreed to. Draper walked to the sedan window. Damien lowered it. "The drive," Draper said. Damien held it out. Draper took it. He looked at it for a moment, this small physical object that represented 4 years of Chen's work and 8 months of federal investigation, and 11 years of a war that had cost people on every side of it something they couldn't get back. "We'll need statements," Draper said. "All of you. Tonight, if possible." "Tonight," Damien said. Draper nodded once and walked back toward his team. On the sidewalk, Victor Sorrento was being walked toward a federal vehicle with his hands secured and his silver hair catching the lot lights and his face completely closed. No performance, no calculation visible anymore. Just the face of a man who has reached the place past which there is nothing left to manage. He didn't look back at the building. He didn't look at Damien. He looked straight ahead at the vehicle he was being walked toward, and he got in, and the door closed, and that was the last time Avery Sinclair ever saw him outside of a courtroom. She lowered her sleeve from Damien's jaw. The cut had slowed. "Grant," she said, "Reyes has him. He's already with Draper's team. Gave his statement at the staging location." Damien looked at her. The exhaustion was visible now, which was the first time she'd seen it on him, and it made him look like a man rather than a structure. "It's done." She looked at him. At the blood drying on his jaw and the drive that was no longer in his hand and the city outside the window doing what it always did. Burning, spinning, performing its indifferent theater of light. "Almost," she said, because Lenora Holloway was still out there somewhere in the city, and both of them knew that Almost was doing the same work that Adapt had done 2 hours ago, carrying the weight of everything that remained between here and finished. Damien looked at her for a long moment. "Almost," he agreed. And then Torres started the car, and they moved. Lenora Holloway was at the airport. Reyes got the alert at 2:14 in the morning, a facial recognition hit from a private terminal on the west side of McCarran, the kind of terminal that existed for people who needed to move without the friction of commercial travel. She had a bag. One bag, which told Avery everything about how long Lenora had been planning for the contingency of running. Not the panicked packing of someone reacting to tonight, but the single prepared bag of someone who had maintained an exit option the way other people maintained insurance. The vehicle was already moving when Damien got the call. He didn't tell Avery to stay behind this time. She didn't offer the argument. They both understood, without negotiating it, that this particular ending belonged to her in a way that the server room and the sidewalk and the Henderson facility had not. Those had been Damien's war, his 11 years, his network, and his people, and his inheritance of conflict. This was the woman who had pressed a dry handkerchief to her face in the front row of the Caldwell Grand and said, loudly enough to carry, "I tried to warn him." This was Avery's. The private terminal was a low building set back from the main airport complex, accessible through a service road that Reyes knew and the driver took without hesitation. 2 of Draper's people were already positioned at the terminal's main entrance. Draper had been efficient about coverage, the mark of a man who had spent 8 months anticipating exactly how the pieces would fall and had prepared for each of them. But the interior of the terminal was not yet secured, which was why the vehicle was moving the way it was moving. They came through the terminal's side entrance at 2:21. The space was small, a waiting area, a service desk, a corridor leading to the tarmac. 4 people visible, a desk attendant who looked up with the specific alarm of someone whose job did not usually include this. 2 men in dark clothing near the corridor who saw Reyes and made the calculation that their employer's situation had changed and moved toward the exit rather than toward confrontation, which was the intelligent choice in which Reyes let them make. And Lenora Holloway, seated in the waiting area with her single bag beside her chair and her coat folded across her lap and her posture as composed as it had been at every point in every room Avery had ever seen her occupy. She looked up when they came in. She looked at Damien first, a brief, assessing glance, the acknowledgement of a known quantity. Then she looked at Reyes, the same. Then she looked at Avery, and she looked for longer, and something moved through her expression that was not guilt and not fear, but something Avery needed a moment to identify. Calculation. Even now, the rapid habitual assessment of a woman determining what leverage remained available and finding the answer and accepting it without visible distress. "Avery," she said. Her voice was exactly what it always was. "You look tired." Avery crossed the waiting area and sat down in the chair directly across from her. Not beside Damien, not behind Reyes. Directly across, close enough to see the specific quality of Lenora's composure, the fine-grained texture of it, the way it was constructed rather than felt. She had spent 4 years being evaluated by this woman from across dinner tables and event spaces and the carefully managed geography of Holloway family gatherings, and she had always felt the assessment without being able to name it, and now she could name it, and the naming changed the room. "You've been running this for 6 years, Avery said. Lenora said nothing. The Sorrento relationship, the holding structure, the political contacts you cultivated using the Holloway name as cover. Avery held her gaze. Grant's father. Did he know? Something shifted. Minimal. The smallest possible adjustment in the architecture of Lenora's composure, the equivalent of a single stone moving in a wall. But Avery had spent her career reading rooms, and she caught it. "Edward knew what he needed to know," Lenora said. "That's not an answer. It's the only one that's available." She looked at Avery with something that might have been, in a different woman, the beginning of honesty. "Edward was a good man. Good men are useful for certain things and not for others. And Victor Sorrento was useful for the others. Victor understood how the world actually operates." She said it without apology or heat. The flat statement of a woman who had made her assessment of reality decades ago and had never found sufficient reason to revise it. The world your father lived in, the world Grant lives in. It's maintained by people like Victor and me who are willing to do what that maintenance requires. "My father," Avery said. Lenora's eyes moved. A fractional shift, the tell of a woman who has just registered that the territory has changed. "You know about Robert Sinclair," Avery said. "You knew before the wedding. That's why you moved against me when you did." The silence that followed had a different quality than the previous ones. Lenora was still composed, but the composition was working harder now. Visible effort where before there had been none. "Tell me," Avery said, "all of it. You're not getting on that plane and you know it. And Draper's people are at the front entrance, and the only thing that's still in your control is whether I understand what happened and why. So tell me." Lenora looked at her for a long moment. Then she looked at the coat folded across her lap and smoothed a crease that wasn't there with one careful hand. "Victor identified the Moretti debt to your family 3 years ago," she said, "through financial forensics, tracking the reason certain Moretti resources had been moved to protect Sinclair business interests over a period of years without apparent commercial justification. He determined that there was a personal obligation involved, a significant one." She paused. Victor's strategy against the Moretti family had always stalled on the question of leverage. Damien Moretti is a man without obvious vulnerabilities, no weakness that could be exploited cleanly, but a debt is a vulnerability. If Victor could identify the person the Morettis felt obligated to protect, he could use that person as a mechanism. "To provoke a response," Avery said, "to expose Damien's decision-making under pressure." Lenora's voice remained even. She was explaining rather than confessing. The distinction was important, and Avery felt it. A man protecting a debt behaves differently than a man protecting a business interest. He takes risks he wouldn't otherwise take. He moves before he's ready. Victor needed Damien to move before he was ready. "So destroying me at the wedding was a trap," Avery said. "Not for me. For Damien. We expected him to intervene more visibly, more publicly, something that would give Victor's legal team grounds to pursue." She stopped. "It didn't work the way you planned," Avery said, "because Damien was careful. He didn't go public, he went private. He came to a bar and sat 2 stools away." For the first time, something crossed Lenora Holloway's face that was not performance and not calculation. It lasted less than 2 seconds, a flicker of something that might have been, in another life, respect. "No," she said. "It didn't work the way we planned." Avery sat with this. The complete picture of it, the 6 years of infrastructure, the 3 years of surveillance on her family's connection to the Morettis, the 16 weeks of fabricated footage, the 40 seconds that had ended her life as she'd known it, all of it architecture. all of it constructed toward a single goal that had nothing to do with her personally and everything to do with what her existence represented to a man she'd never met. She had been a tool, selected, shaped, and deployed. She should have felt the anger of that, and she did, underneath, a banked heat she would carry for a long time. But sitting across from Lenore Holloway in a private terminal at 2 a.m. with the woman's single bag beside her chair, what she felt most was something colder and more clarifying. She was looking at a person who had spent decades making herself indispensable to power by being willing to treat other people as variables, and who was now discovering what it felt like to be the variable. "Grant," Avery said. Lenore's jaw tightened, the smallest movement, but there. "He's given his statement to federal investigators," Avery said. "He's been cooperative. Draper's team has confirmed the evidence he provided is sufficient to establish your knowing participation in Sorrento's financial network." She paused. "He didn't have to do that. He could have protected you. He chose not to." The thing that moved through Lenore's face then was the most human thing Avery had seen from her. It wasn't grief. Grief requires having expected something different. It was recognition. The recognition of a woman seeing the full consequence of a calculation she had made years ago about how much her son was willing to excuse in the name of family loyalty, and discovering she had been wrong. She had been wrong about Grant the same way she'd been wrong about Damien. She had expected the behavior of men who operated the way she did, strategically, without sentimentality, willing to absorb betrayal as the cost of staying in the game. She had raised a son who was none of those things. Whatever Grant Holloway was, and Avery was still working out the full accounting of that, he was not his mother. And Lenora, who prided herself on knowing how people operated, had failed to know the person she'd had the most access to for 34 years. Draper's people came through the main entrance at 2:29, 2 agents, efficient and quiet, and Lenora stood when they came in, stood before they reached her, which was her last act of control, the refusal to be made to rise. She straightened her coat. She picked up her bag and then set it down again, understanding it wasn't going with her. She looked at Avery one final time. "You'll find," she said, "that winning isn't as clean as you think it's going to be." "I know," Avery said. "I built things for a living. Nothing is ever as clean as the plan." Lenora held her gaze for one more second. Then she walked toward the agents with her coat over her arm and her chin level, performing composure to the last available audience. And Avery watched her go and felt the specific weight of an ending that was not triumphant and not simple and was entirely, completely real. The statements took until 5 a.m. Draper ran them in sequence, Damien first, then Reyes, then Chen, whose federal status transformed the room's dynamic in ways that the other investigators were still visibly adjusting to, then Grant, who arrived at the federal building looking like a man who had been hit and zip-tied, and had then given several hours of testimony and was running purely on the specific fuel of a decision made and committed to. He and Avery passed each other in the corridor outside the interview rooms, and he stopped. She stopped. He looked at her. In the corridor's fluorescent light, he looked very young, which was not something she had thought about Grant Holloway before. He had always presented with the polished ease of someone who had never had to question whether rooms would open for him, and that ease had read as maturity when it was actually just the confidence of someone who had not yet been tested by anything that mattered. He had been tested now. He looked his age, and then some. "I'm sorry," he said. "I know that—" He stopped, started again. "There isn't a version of that sentence that's enough." "No," she agreed. "There isn't." He absorbed this without argument, which was the right response, and she registered it. "The footage," he said. "I want you to know I didn't know. When I played it, I believed it. I need you to know that." She looked at him carefully. She had been asking herself this question for 9 days. Whether Grant had known, whether the man at the altar had been a full participant or a directed instrument. The evidence, when she assembled it honestly, pointed one direction. Lenora had used her son the same way she'd used everyone else, as a variable in a calculation he wasn't aware he was part of. She had given him the footage, and he had believed it because he had been given no reason not to, because the woman who gave it to him had spent 34 years making herself his primary source of truth about the world. "I know," Avery said, and she did know it. She didn't forgive it. The knowledge that it was true didn't dissolve the 40 seconds on those screens, or the 500 people, or the ivory silk dress on the bathroom floor. But she knew it, which was a different and more durable thing. Grant nodded. He looked like he wanted to say more and understood there wasn't more to say. He went into the interview room and the door closed, and she went to give her own statement. She was done at 5:47. The sky outside the federal building was doing the thing desert skies did before sunrise, a specific shade of dark blue that existed for approximately 20 minutes and then was gone, replaced by the rapid escalation of a Nevada dawn that didn't build gradually but arrived like a decision. She stood on the steps with her jacket pulled close and her phone in her hand, and she looked at the city. Damien came out behind her. He stood beside her without speaking. The cut above his ear had been cleaned and closed with 2 small strips of tape that Rosa had applied at some point in the past hour. He looked like a man who had been awake all night and had not found this unusual. They stood like that for a while. "Draper," she said, "the Sorrento case moves to indictment within 60 days. The financial network is fully documented, 17 counts across the original conspiracy, with the Holloway material adding 5 more." He paused. "Lenora will be charged separately. Her cooperation will be the question. Draper thinks she'll negotiate rather than go to trial." "She'll negotiate," Avery said. "She'll find the angle that preserves the most and give up the rest. It's what she does." "Yes." "Will it be enough?" "The charges." "For Sorrento?" "Yes. He won't see the outside of a federal facility for the remainder of his life." Damien's voice was even, the particular evenness of a man describing the conclusion of something that has cost him more than he will account for in the present tense. "For Lenora, less certain. Cooperation has value in federal proceedings." Avery thought about Lenora walking toward Draper's agents with her chin level. "She'll manage whatever she gets," she said. "That's who she is." Damien didn't disagree. "The footage," she said. "Draper's team has the original files. The chain of custody is intact. The editing facility connection is documented." She looked at her phone. "My attorney says the civil case for defamation against the Holloway estate is viable. Patricia wants to file within the month. You should let her." "I will." She looked at the sky. "Not for the money, for the record. I want it on record, in a civil court, with full discovery, that the footage was fabricated and who fabricated it and why. I want it somewhere that anyone can read." "It will be." She turned to look at him. In the pre-dawn light, he looked different than he had in the bar 9 days ago. Or she was seeing him differently, which was more likely. She had watched him move through a Henderson corridor and make decisions under pressure and sit in a federal interview room for 2 hours without complaint, and she had a more complete picture now than she'd had across 2 stools of bar space. "The marriage," she said. He looked at her. "We should talk about what it is now," she said. "Now that what it was built to do has been done." He was quiet for a moment. The sky was beginning its rapid shift toward dawn. "Patricia has the exit clause documentation," he said. "Everything Ray has found, everything Chen's work produced, the complete federal file is provided to us. It's yours regardless of what you decide. That was the term, and it holds." "I know it holds." She held his gaze. "I'm not asking about the contract." The pause that followed was the longest he'd allowed himself with her. She watched him navigate it, watched the man who moved through rooms without wasting anything take the time this question required, not to calculate but to be honest, which were not the same thing, and he clearly knew the difference. "I'm not going to tell you what I want," he said finally, "because what I want isn't relevant to a decision you should make without that pressure. That's very controlled of you. It's the only thing I know how to be." "I know," she said. "I've noticed." She looked back at the city. The neon was fading as the sky brightened. The particular Las Vegas phenomenon of the artificial light losing its dominance to the natural, the glitter receding as the desert reasserted itself every morning without fail. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. "I want to be clear about that. Not because of the contract, and not because I feel I owe you something, and not because I don't have anywhere else to go. I have a professional reputation to rebuild, and I have work to do, and I intend to do it from here." She paused. "But I'm also not going to pretend the past 9 days were transactional. They weren't, for either of us." Damien was looking at her, She could feel the quality of it, that total, careful attention she had cataloged from the first night, the attention of a man who had learned to see things whole. No, he said, they weren't. So we figure out what comes next, she said, without a contract telling us what it is. That's a more complicated arrangement than the one we started with. Most things worth building are. He was quiet. Then, with the slight adjustment of expression she had learned was as close as he came to a smile, the modification of his composure, rather than a break in it. You'd know. She turned back to the dawn. The city was changing in the light, becoming its daytime self, less theatrical, more structural, the bones of it visible when the performance of the night was stripped away. She had designed 3 properties in this city and argued about sconce placement and drapery weight and load-bearing walls, and she thought about what it meant to build something in a place like this, where the ground was desert underneath all the concrete and the heat was relentless, and everything that survived here had learned to survive it without softening. She thought about the Moretti properties Damien had mentioned, the ones Lenora had been trying to acquire, the ones that would now remain. She thought about what it would mean to turn some of them toward something that had nothing to do with the economy of fear and obligation, the legitimate face of a family that had survived long enough to choose what it wanted to be next. She thought about her father on a construction site 23 years ago. 4 minutes. The decision made in 4 minutes that had echoed through everything that came after, that had shaped a debt carried across a generation, that had put her on a bar stool on the worst night of her life across 2 spaces of mahogany from the man now standing beside her on federal building steps at 5:50 in the morning. She would never be able to tell him what that 4 minutes had become. He was 11 years gone, and the story would have to live in her instead of in him, and she would carry it the way he had apparently carried his side of it, quietly, as a fact of the world, without needing it acknowledged. I have a question, she said. Ask. The properties. The 3 Lenora was trying to acquire. She looked at him. What are they? He studied her. A former hotel on the east side. A warehouse complex near the Arts District. A commercial block in Henderson that's been sitting vacant for 2 years. She thought about the warehouse complex, the Arts District, the specific quality of vacant space in a city that never stopped moving, the way emptiness in Las Vegas felt different than emptiness anywhere else, charged with potential and pressure, waiting. I want to look at them, she said, professionally, no obligation, no terms. I just want to look. He looked at her for a moment. When? When I've slept, she said, and eaten something, and talked to Patricia about the civil filing. She turned toward the steps. And when you've had that cut on your ear properly looked at by someone with actual medical credentials. It's fine. It's 2 strips of tape applied by a woman whose primary qualification is running your compound efficiently, which she does extremely well, but which is not the same as being a physician. She started down the steps. There's a clinic on West Charleston that opens at 7. We have an hour. She heard him exhale behind her. Not quite a laugh, but the adjacent thing. The sound of a man who has spent a long time in rooms where he was the final authority on every decision, discovering what it feels like when someone simply tells him what comes next and is correct about it. He came down the steps beside her. The car was at the curb. Torres, who had apparently not slept either and showed no sign of requiring it, was at the wheel. The city was fully into its dawn now, the desert light doing what it did, flattening and clarifying simultaneously, removing shadow and revealing structure, making everything look like exactly what it was. Avery got in, Damien got in, the door closed. West Charleston, Torres said. Not a question. West Charleston, Avery confirmed. The car pulled away from the federal building and moved into the morning traffic of a city that had been running all night without them and would run all day without requiring their permission, indifferent and continuous the way cities were. The neon was mostly dark now. The desert light had won, as it always did, as it did every morning over every artifice the city had ever constructed on top of its ancient and indifferent sand. Avery looked out the window and watched it go. The strip in the daylight, smaller and more human than it was at night, the scaffolding of its illusion visible in the morning. She had stood in this city at 24 with blueprints and bad coffee and argued about sconce placement with men who didn't think she knew what she was talking about. She had built things here. She had had things taken from her here. She had sat on a bar stool in a wedding dress and made a decision that had led through 9 days of the most complex and costly and clarifying experience of her adult life to this car, this morning, this city, showing her its bones. She was 31 years old. She had a civil case to file and a reputation to rebuild and 3 vacant properties to look at and an arrangement with a man beside her that was no longer defined by a contract and was not yet defined by anything else and would have to be built the way everything worth building was built. From the ground, from the actual ground, with attention to what was load-bearing and what was ornamental and what could flex under pressure and what would crack. She knew how to do that. It was in the end the only thing she had ever really known how to do. The clinic on West Charleston opened at 7:02. They were the first patients through the door. The doctor who looked at the cut above Damien's ear was a young woman who had clearly also been awake most of the night and asked no questions about how the injury had occurred, which was the right instinct and which Avery respected. She cleaned it properly and closed it with 3 actual sutures and told him to come back in a week, and he said he would. And she looked at him with the expression of someone who knows they're being told something that may or may not be true and has made peace with the limitation of their influence. Avery, sitting in the plastic chair against the clinic wall while this happened, understood the expression completely. Outside the clinic window, Las Vegas was becoming its daytime self. The tourists beginning to move, the service industry shifting registers, the city running the quiet machinery of its actual life beneath the performance of what it showed the world. She watched it and thought about what Lenora had said on the terminal steps. Winning isn't as clean as you think it's going to be. She hadn't thought it would be clean. She was a builder. She knew what sites looked like after the work was done and before the finish was applied. The raw state of a thing that was structurally complete but not yet habitable. The gap between built and livable that required patience and attention and the willingness to keep working after the dramatic part was over. That was where she was. That was where they all were. The doctor finished. Damien came and sat in the chair beside her. His jaw was shaved close, and the tape was gone, and the 3 sutures were small and precise, and would leave, she thought, a very faint scar that would be visible if you were close enough and looking. She had learned in 9 days to be close enough and looking. "Ready?" he said. She stood up. "There's a place 2 blocks from here," she said. "They open at 6:30. The coffee is bad, but the eggs are correct." He looked at her. "How do you know?" "I worked a site 4 blocks from here for 3 months in 2021. I know every restaurant in a 6-block radius by what they do well and what they don't." She picked up her jacket. "The eggs are correct. Trust me." He stood. They walked out of the clinic into the full morning light of a Las Vegas day, and the door swung closed behind them. And the city received them back without ceremony, which was exactly right, which was the only way any of this could have ended. Not with a statement, but with a step. Not with a conclusion, but with the next ordinary moment of a life that had been broken open and was, slowly and without drama, beginning to be rebuilt. 2 blocks. The coffee was bad. The eggs were correct. They ate without talking much, which was its own kind of language. The language of 2 people who had said the necessary things and were resting now in the space that follows necessity, where what comes next gets decided not by urgency, but by choice. Outside the window, the desert light held everything in its flat, clarifying gaze, and the city ran on, and the story that Las Vegas would tell about the woman whose shattered wedding had rewritten the rules of 2 dynasties was already becoming something that would outlast everyone who had tried to use her as a variable in their calculations. Because she was not a variable, had never been a variable, and the city, which knew the difference between performance and the real thing, would remember that long after the neon came back on and the night reclaimed its territory and the whole indifferent theater began again.